Poesia Pantaneira, de Manuel de Barros. Quem se aproxima das origens se renova. Eu quero alcançar o sotaque das minhas origens, encontrar os fósseis linguísticos. O fascínio poético vem das raízes da fala. Estudei nos livros demais, porém aprendo melhor no ver, no pegar, no provar, no cheirar. A beleza se explica melhor por não haver razão nenhuma nela. Eu não quero a boa razão das coisas. Eu quero o feitiço das palavras. Não gosto das palavras fatigadas de informar. Dou mais respeito àquelas que vivem de barriga no chão, tipo água, pedra, sapo. Dou respeito às coisas desimportantes e aos seres desimportantes. Eu prezo insetos mais que aviões. Prezo a velocidade das tartarugas, bem mais que a dos mísseis. É que eu tenho em mim esse atraso de nascença. Eu fui aparelhada para gostar de passarinhos, de borboletas, e tenho abundância de ser feliz por isso. O meu quintal é maior do que o mundo, porque eu não sou da informática, eu sou da invencionática. Natureza é uma força que inunda como os desertos, e eu só uso a palavra para compor os meus silêncios. E agora, para compor os nossos silêncios, é com um imenso prazer que eu dou a palavra ao jornalista norte-americano Richard Louv. Ele é especialista em advocacy pela infância e cofundador do movimento internacional Children Nature Network. É autor do livro A Última Criança na Natureza, Last Child in the Woods, já traduzido para mais de 15 línguas em 20 países. E hoje lançado aqui em português pelo Instituto Alana. Seja bem-vindo, Richard.
Thank you for being here. It's a very difficult thing to follow Suzanne because she was so eloquent, and particularly your daughter's poem. That was 8 years old. Amazing. She certainly doesn't have a creativity disability. Wonderful. I want to thank the folks for bringing me here all the way to Brazil from San Diego, California. Louv, I've gotten to know very well. She and Ana Lucia, I think someone else, came to San Diego over a year ago. We spent some time talking. Oh, okay, all right. And we talked a lot about this issue. And Louv, I met her husband this morning. Where's her husband? He skipped out on you. Oh, here he is. I said, he introduced himself as Louv, his better half. And I said, knowing Louv, I think you're probably right. I said that Louv is a force of nature. And he said, yes, in the morning he gets up and he checks the temperature, the wind, the rain, and Louv. Ana Lucia, thank you so much for Alana and what you're doing here in Brazil. I know that you feel that you're following the United States created this Children Nature Network, and the movement is on its way in the United States, and that Brazil has to catch up. What I hope is that you do an end run around this, past the United States, and doing even more inventive and great things. And Alana Institute is amazing. I want to say early, I don't do PowerPoint. I'm sorry. I don't do PowerPoint. It's not because I'm ideologically opposed to PowerPoint. It's because I'm really bad at it. I've done it twice. And the first time I did everything wrong. There was too much information on every slide. It was really bad, really bad. And the second time I did it, though, was to an audience of about 500 people. I really worked on my PowerPoint presentation. And I was up there and I was speaking and I was clicking. I wasn't looking at the screen much, but I was clicking and I was clicking and speaking and clicking and speaking. And I noticed that everybody was really looking carefully at my PowerPoint. And I thought, I've nailed this. I'm really good at PowerPoint now. And then finally, after quite a while, I looked around and realized that my screensaver had gone on. And it was picture after picture of my wife and I on a beach in Mexico. And she looked really good. You know those moments in your life when you realize your true importance on the earth? That was one of mine. So I haven't done PowerPoint since. I haven't worked up my courage for that. I'd like to start by reading some passage from Last Child in the Woods. I'd also like to thank Quivira, the publisher of Last Child in the Woods in Portuguese in Brazil, and for Alana's role in making that happen. I'm very gratified. If, when we were young, we tramped through forests of Nebraska cottonwoods, or raised pigeons on a rooftop in Queens, or fished for Ozark bluegills, or felt the swell of a wave, lifting our boat, or felt the swell of a wave that traveled 1,000 miles before lifting our boat, then we were bound to the natural world, and we remain so today. Nature still informs our years, lifts us, carries us. For children, nature comes in many forms: a newborn calf, a pet that lives and dies, a worn path through the woods, a fort nested in stinging nettles, a damp, mysterious edge of a vacant lot. Nature can frighten a child too, and this fright serves a purpose. In nature, the child finds freedom, fantasy, and privacy, a place distant from the adult world, a separate peace. These are some of the utilitarian values of nature, but at a deeper level, nature gives itself to children for its own sake, not as a reflection of a culture. At this level, inexplicable nature provokes humility. Most of you are here today because when you were kids, when you were a kid, you had some special place in nature. Maybe it was a field, maybe it was in the woods, maybe it was at the end of your parents' yard where the trees began. Maybe it was a beach. Maybe it was a little patch of grass next to the apartment complex. Perhaps you're thinking right now about your special place in nature when you were kids. It was your place. That's why you're here. There is no guarantee that children in the future will have that place to go in their home. That's why you're here. To help make that guarantee. My special place in nature, I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas on both sides of the border. And I could go out my back door as a teenager, as an 8-year-old, and through the yard, through a hedge at the end of the yard, into the cornfield where my underground fort was. And from there on into the woods and the fields and the farms that seemed to go on forever. I spent much of my young boyhood in those woods with my dog as a collie. My parents didn't know where it was, but my dog did. And I spent day after day, every minute that I could, in those woods. And I had a sense then, and I can't explain why. I would not have been able to articulate it then. But I had a sense that this place, this special place, was shaping me, and I needed to protect it. Those were my woods. My woods. And they entered my heart, and they're still there today. I decided to protect my woods from the bulldozers that I knew were taking out nearby woods. And so as an 8-year-old, I pulled out, I think, probably hundreds of survey stakes. You know, the stakes that are put in by the surveyors to mark the areas that are going to be taken away. I pulled out hundreds of survey stakes. I had a big pile of them behind my hedge in the backyard. I think I held them off for a while. I had a residential developer a few years ago in LA told me that I would have been much more effective if I'd simply moved the stakes around. I don't really advocate that kids do that, not really. But those were my woods. I felt a deep sense of ownership of those woods. I owned them and they owned me. That was my special place in nature. I often tell that story about pulling out the survey stakes to protect my woods as a kid. I was speaking a few years ago to a group called the Quivira Coalition, which is an organization that brings environmentalists and ranchers together across a big political divide to protect land, to do land trusts, to protect not only nature but the ranching life. In the question and answer period afterwards, a rancher stood up, and he was the real deal. His genes had not been acid washed. He was sunburned. He was in his 60s, I think, kind of like, had a white handlebar mustache. He was wearing a cowboy hat. Half of the people in the audience were wearing cowboy hats, literally. He had big, thick, rimmed, plastic rimmed glasses, sunburned, and he said, "You know that story you told about pulling out survey stakes?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I did that as a boy." And then he began to cry in front of 500 people, half of whom were wearing cowboy hats. This big, tough rancher. And despite his deep sense of embarrassment, he continued to talk about his sense of grief that he might be in one of the last generations to have that kind of sense of ownership of land. And to him, it had very little, if anything, to do with money. I think what he was describing, the sense of ownership and being owned by that nature, owning nature, being owned by it. I think what he was describing is this sense that many of us have when we are in the natural world. And this can be in a city or this can be in the Yukon. That the earth beneath us, on which we stand, has meaning. And that the land and the trees, all of the other creatures around us, has meaning. And that the sky that holds us to the ground has meaning. That all of us are held to the earth, held by the natural world. And because of that, we feel that we are someone, and we feel that we are someplace, and we feel that we belong on the earth and in the universe. Without nature, we do not feel that. children that grow up without nature do not feel that. Again, that is why you're here. That is why this movement to connect children and therefore adults, because children do grow up. That is why you're here, to give future generations that sense of being held by the universe and that they matter. Last Child in the Woods began, I wrote this for several reasons. I'm often asked why I wrote it by journalists, and they often want to know the journalistic reasons that I wrote it, and there are journalistic reasons. It's a good story. I was a newspaper columnist for many years, and this is a good thing to write about. But it really started much earlier. It started in those woods where I had that sense of being. It also started with my family. Suzanne spoke eloquently about how nature bonded her family, and that is one of the gifts that nature gives families, a sense of bonding. When parents spend more time with their kids in the natural world, the family just seems to naturally become tighter. The best, and I wrote an essay about this that appears in my second book on this issue, which is called The Nature Principle. And I wrote this essay as a kind of confession. I'll tell you why in a second. The best times of my family when I was growing up were spent in nature. They were spent fishing. They were spent in the backyard, in a garden in the backyard. They were spent in those woods, following my father along through the snow, following the tracks of rabbits. I can still see him wearing his army coat, carrying a BB gun, very powerless BB gun. And watching my collie, my dog, bound through the snow along with us. This beautiful, beautiful dog in the snow. In the backyard, we had a big garden. One year, my father decided to plant Swiss chard. I don't know if you know about Swiss chard, but you harvest it and it grows back. You harvest it, it grows back very quickly in a season, and he planted too much Swiss chard. And I remember that summer, I went all over the neighborhood with grocery bags filled with Swiss chard, giving it to the neighbors because we had way too much Swiss chard. My mother used to talk about that as the summer the Swiss chard ate the neighborhood. But I remember following my father and helping him garden in the backyard and seeing the tan on the back of his neck and the creases in his neck where you could see the dirt as he would work and the sweat. And I would pull out the rocks and the dog bones that had been buried there by my dog as he tilled the land in our backyard, or race ahead of him to help him. I remember the whole family in the backyard doing this, working, and a storm coming up, and clouds suddenly coming up, and this is Missouri, and seeing the sky and the clouds turn green. And we knew that that was a sign, not a good sign, that was a sign that maybe a tornado was forming somewhere. And the wind coming up, and the family racing to the back door of the walk-in basement. And that sense of power in the air. In this essay, this kind of confession, I describe how over time, those times in nature with my family became less and less. My father got a better job. We moved to a more affluent area of Kansas City in a bigger house. The garden disappeared. We didn't have a garden at the next house. We did have some woods that I could still play in. But my father had a mental illness that only started showing up then, and he became an alcoholic. And the years passed. We didn't spend time in nature. The garden disappeared. He didn't fish much. But his goal in life, his dream, was to retire in his late 40s and build a little house on a lake out in the Ozarks and fish all day. He retired, they built the house, but by that time it was too late. He very seldom left the kitchen table. And he did not have a good ending to his life. I wrote that as a confession to admit that I have a bias. I am biased on this issue. For my whole life, without really knowing it, I've connected the idea of being in nature with health and with family, with good times, with my father when he was my hero. So I report on a lot of science in the 3 books I've written about this issue. But I make clear that I have a bias. I do not cherry pick the studies. I have yet to see a study that in any way undermines the argument that I make in these books about the connection of nature experience and health. I don't cherry pick the studies. I'm very, very conservative in a way about how I report the science. But I still do have this bias. I made clear in the second book that I don't base my argument for connecting children to nature and reconnecting our culture to the natural world. I don't base that only on science either. I base it also on morality, on common sense. But in particular morality, if we only argue this case based on scientific studies, it will not be a strong case. Partly because science changes. You know, next week coffee will be bad for us again. But also because the most important arguments we make are arguments from the heart that we know are true. The civil rights movement in the United States, if we had waited for all the data to come in, all the studies to be done, we'd still be waiting. In fact, at that time, some of the science, supposedly, in the 40s and the 50s, was opposed to the idea of equality among people. So we can't make this argument as you go out into Brazil and talk to people about this. Make the argument on science, but only in part. Make it also on the fact that this is a moral issue. When you look at the research, which I'll describe in a minute, it's obvious that there is a scientific case to be made. But if it is true that nature has this profound effect on both the health, the physical health, the psychological health, and the cognitive functioning, the ability to think and create, if this growing body of evidence, scientific evidence, is true, and if E.O. Wilson's hypothesis, E.O. Wilson at Harvard talks about the biophilia hypothesis. The biophilia hypothesis holds that we are genetically programmed to have an affiliation with the rest of nature, of the natural world. That we have not changed biologically. We are still hunters and gatherers. We need the rest of nature to be whole. If E.O. Wilson is right about that, and all this research is correct, then this is truly a moral issue. Because every child, every adult deserves to have that which makes them whole as a human being. That's kind of the definition of a human right. That it's essential for our humanity, that something is essential for our humanity. Every human being has a right to that which is essential for his or her humanity. I believe that experiences in the natural world, whether it's in the Yukon or in the middle of a densely populated city, children have a human right to that experience because it helps make them whole. As long as we talk about the connection of children to nature as a nice to have, it will not be taken seriously. It will be patronized, this issue. It is not just a nice to have. It is a have to have. It is essential to our humanity. If we lose that connection as the species, by definition, I believe we have lost our humanity. Several years ago, with the second book, The Nature Principle, which is more about what I call nature deficit disorder, which, by the way, is not a known medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but it's not. It's a way to talk about this issue that we have felt for a long time, but really haven't had much language to describe it. I began to write about this as a human right. I would ask my friends, do you think that children have a right to a walk in the woods? And my friends, many of them are, in fact, probably most of them, are environmentalists. I consider myself an environmentalist. But their response to that question was unexpected. It made them uncomfortable. People have a right to experience nature. Now, at the beginning, I thought, maybe they're thinking about this in a legalistic way. Oh, great, one more reason to sue each other. And I think it was part of their response was that, and I understand that. But I wasn't talking about this in a legalistic way. I wasn't asking the question about the law. I was asking a moral question. Do children, in fact, do all of us, have a right to a walk in the woods? They were very uncomfortable with that, many of them. And over time, I realized and began to understand that I shared some of that discomfort with the same question. That deep down, someone who cares about the environment, cares about conservation, may intuitively feel, why should one species that is destroying so many other species have a right to the pleasure of their company? The problem is, even if you believe that, as a practical matter, if you really care about protecting endangered species, protecting nature, then you must care about one of the endangered species, which is the child in nature. Because if children do not grow up with a connection to the natural world, actually learning to love it personally, hands muddy, feet wet, if they don't have that intimate experience with nature, they cannot know it, and if they do not know it, they can never love it. And if they can never love it, they will never protect it. So just as a practical matter, I think we need to pull back from this feeling that maybe people don't belong in nature because people are not good. Now, that was the kind of the environmental left that I heard that response from, that discomfort with the question. From some people, not all people at all, but from some people on the religious right, I heard a similar response to that question. And it was a response that basically said that nature doesn't matter. That at best, nature is a stepping stone to the real paradise. And nature's only there for our domination, for human beings to use, because God put it there for us to use. What I found interesting about both responses to that question, from the left and the right, is that in both cases there was this tendency to think of nature as the other, as separate from human beings. Well, it's not. We're part of nature whether we like it or not. We're part of nature whether nature likes it or not. And until we see our place in nature, we will continue to see the environmental and social problems all around us continue to grow worse and worse. Until we see ourselves as part of nature. And until we connect ourselves and our children and future generations in a positive way to the rest of the natural world. I began to argue that, make that argument. I wrote an essay in Orion magazine saying that this should be considered a human right. I had that argument in the Nature Principles. And I'm pleased to say that in 2012, with a little help from the Children in Nature Network, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Childhood, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, which is a worldwide organization of tens of thousands of conservation organizations, NGOs. The IUCN passed a resolution that said a positive connection to nature is a human right for all children everywhere. This needs to be seen as a human right for all children, not just the children of parents who care about nature, not just the children who happen to live next to a park, not just the children who have the means to go to a park. It has to be seen as a human right for even, perhaps even especially, for the kids who do not have access to nature now. There are two bodies of research that have emerged in recent years. One body is about the disconnect between children and nature, and I focused first on the United States. That's where what I knew was the United States. But I learned in the writing of the book, and in particular after the book came out, I learned that this is in fact a worldwide issue, often in places that one would least expect it. This disconnect from children, between children and nature. The truth is, this is unprecedented in human history and prehistory. A case can be made this disconnection began with the invention of agriculture. It certainly began to widen with the Industrial Revolution. But within the last 30 to 40 years, we have seen the pace of that disconnection grow at an exponential rate. To the point where the circumference, studies have been done of the circumference that kids can go from their own home in the United States, in the UK. I don't know if that study has been done in Brazil, but the radius that used to be for our grandparents, miles away from home, has shrunk. Now it's maybe at the doorstep. And the ability to go outside and have some kind of independent play has shrunk along with the connection to the natural world. This has profound implications for health, for physical health, for psychological health, for ability to learn and create, and I think for spiritual health as well. Not only has free play disappeared, but this intimate experience with nature certainly has disappeared along with it. Those two trends, the disappearance of independent play of children, is a parallel to the trend of the disconnection from the natural world. Both of those things are happening at the same time. More and more of our children's lives are spent being controlled by the controllers of the video game, by electronics, by fear, Fear is one of the big causes for this disconnection of children from nature. Parents in the United States, and as they are here too, are desperately fearful of strangers, of human beings. And that fear flows into a fear of nature itself. In some neighborhoods, that fear is well-founded. In the United States, and I know that there are cultural differences between the United States and Brazil, but in the United States, parents barely feel comfortable letting their kids out the front door because they fear crime, they fear strangers. The truth is that violent crime toward children in the United States has been going down for at least 3 decades. But our perception of crime has been expanding. And that is because of the expansion and the growth of the 24-hour news cycle. Because a handful of terrible crimes against children are reported, particularly on CNN and Fox and on the 24-hour news cycle on cable TV, cable news. They're repeated over and over and over again. And when they get done telling you about the crime, they tell you about the trial over and over and over again. That's the very definition of conditioning. This repetition of a relatively few crimes creates in our mind the image of a child snatcher on every street corner and in every grove of trees. And I know that there are real dangers out there. I know that in some neighborhoods of Brazil, as in some neighborhoods in the United States, there is real danger. But it's not nearly, at least in the United States, what we think it is. I believe that we need to begin to think in terms of comparative risk. Yes, there is danger outside. Yes, there is danger from nature itself. In fact, that's part of its attraction, particularly to teenagers. As a kid, I loved the fact that it was a little bit dangerous out there. I loved the fact that I might run into a rattlesnake. In fact, I looked for rattlesnakes. There is danger beyond the front door. There is danger in the natural world. The greatest increase in child obesity in our history in the United States occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest growth of organized sports for children in our history. And it's not because soccer or football causes child obesity. I'm not saying that, but it's not doing the trick. It's not solving the problem. And pediatricians know this, and they will talk about this. There's also a risk to psychological health. There's even a risk, I believe, to democracy. In order for a democracy to be healthy, you actually have to get to know your neighbors. You actually have to go out the front door. You actually have to have a sense of the environment around you. I like to talk about people fear nature. The most poisonous spider in North America lives in our houses, not outdoors. It's called the brown recluse. I did some research into this, and I learned that the brown recluse, one of its favorite places to hide in our houses, it's very, very poisonous, is in the piles of clothes that teenagers leave on the floor of their room. I tried that on my sons, tried to convince them that that's why they should pick up their clothes, but it didn't work. The EPA in the United States has reported that in most neighborhoods, not all, the worst air pollution is not outdoors. It's not good out there, but it's not outdoors. The worst air pollution is inside because of carpets, because of all these chemicals that are in the air from building construction materials and all of that. There is danger out there, but there is, I believe, an even greater danger in raising our children under protected house arrest. So we need to begin to think in terms of comparative risk. One other example. Pediatricians no longer see in the United States very many broken bones among children, which used to be a rite of passage. What they see now are carpal tunnel syndrome from too much time on computers, too much time in front of video games. And carpal tunnel syndrome takes a lot longer to heal. Sometimes it will last a lifetime than the typical broken bone for a child. We need to think in terms of comparative risk. The research that has come out, the other body of research about the disconnect between children and nature, is the positive, is the good news. It's about the fact that in the University of Illinois, ongoing set of research shows that the symptoms of attention deficit disorder go down significantly with just a little bit of contact with nature for children. Just a walk through trees in an urban park and they will see the symptoms of attention deficit disorder begin to lower. The people who are doing those studies suggest that nature therapy be added to the other two therapies for attention deficit disorder, which are behavior modification and Ritalin and other pharmaceuticals. I want to make clear I'm not a radical on Ritalin, on these drugs for attention deficit disorder. Some kids do need some kind of medication. But what proportion of the huge increase in the number of kids that are being prescribed Ritalin because they have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder? In some schools in the United States, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin for attention deficit. 30% of the boys is almost always prescribed to boys. How can that be? Some of those kids do need some medication. But how can it be that that increases? How can it be that toddlers, little children, are the biggest cohort for the biggest growth, largest growth in the prescription of antidepressants? How can that be? Might both of those circumstances have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from kids in the first place? The teenage suicide rate, how can it be that it's so high and growing? Might that have something to do with the fact that we changed childhood so quickly? And evolution doesn't happen that fast. How am I doing on time? I have no clue. I know you're talking. No, can I go ahead? That's 10 minutes. Okay, good. And then we'll have the Q&A. I do wear a watch, Suzanne, but I don't know how to read it. The good news here is that this research does exist. The good news is that research showing the benefits to physical health, for instance, are impressive. Studies, and these studies are done of adults more than kids. The studies showing people on treadmills in indoor gyms, comparing them to people doing green exercise outdoors, gardening or hiking, but both groups burning exactly the same number of calories. People on the treadmills in the indoor gyms get healthier. Their blood pressure gets better, their psychological health improves, but the people burning exactly the same number of calories, but doing it outdoors in nature, get even healthier. We don't quite understand why that value added is there. But many of us believe it has a lot to do with the Biophilia Hypothesis, that we are hardwired as a species to need the natural world, the rest of the natural world. Studies on mental health, there are more studies on this, on mental health, than there are on physical health. And they show a reduction in depression of children, of adults, a reduction of stress and toxic stress, with just a little bit of contact with nature. In terms of cognitive functioning, one of the things that I want to point out about this relationship between the disappearance of independent play for children and the disappearance of nature experience, those are related. One of the reasons that independent play is so important is because of the creation of the ability to control ourselves. That's developed early on. It's called executive function. In young children, that's most of the time, that's developed early on in childhood. That's the voice inside you that says that, Rich, maybe it's not a good idea to follow your buddies over the cliff. It's self-control. It's being your own executive function. The way that executive function is formed in young children is primarily through independent make-believe play, where you're the boss, you're the executive, you're the king or the queen of the world that you've created. And like your children created this world called Essex. They were in charge of that imaginary world. What happens to children if they don't have very much time in their lives, in their young lives, for independent make-believe play? Is that executive function formed? Could that have some implications for an economy that depends on entrepreneurs who have to be their own bosses later on? Might it have something to do with the fact that so many kids act out in class? And that gets pinned on attention deficit disorder, but maybe it's because kids didn't play enough on their own, independently, being their own creator, making up their own rules when they're little kids. Doing that in the natural world is particularly easy. Studies of natural play spaces, and I think this is particularly important for cities because obviously there aren't forests in this city, but there are, certainly in Sao Paulo, there's not a lot of big areas that could be considered nature there, or natural areas. So it's particularly important on school grounds, in parks, and so forth, in urban areas, that kids have natural play spaces, not just those concrete or asphalt playgrounds, but natural play spaces with vegetation, with things to climb, with logs to climb up on, and all that. The studies have shown that natural play spaces, children play differently than they do in flat playgrounds, asphalt playgrounds. On a natural play space, kids are far more likely to invent their own games, executive function. They're also far more likely to invite other kids to play with them that don't look like them, that are of different races, a different gender. There is also some evidence out of New Zealand that natural play spaces, on natural play spaces, there is less bullying in children's play, which has led me to believe that Donald Trump should spend more time on natural play spaces. In the school, around the kids, around the school, the kids getting out on field trips and all that. Those schools, when you factor out the socioeconomic issues, those schools, kids get much higher grades or significantly higher grades on standardized tests. Similar study in Chicago of 500 urban schools. Ongoing study, the preliminary results show that, in fact, the same thing happens in those schools. And the people doing those studies say that this is probably as effective or more effective than anything that was tried in the last 20 years for educational reform to raise test scores. So on and on, this positive research, and the Children Nature Network has a section of it, a research library. You can go to that library, it's childrenandnature.org, and you can see the reports on about 300 or over 300 studies, most of which are about the benefits of nature to children. The good news also is that this movement has emerged. Now, people were working on this issue in the United States and certainly in Brazil long ago, long before a book came along, long before the Children Nature Network. Some of you are here today that have worked on this issue for decades. But at least in the United States, the people who work on this issue weren't getting much notice or respect in the media. This issue was not on the stove, let alone on the front burner 10 years ago. But since then, we've seen an explosion in research, but we've also seen huge amount of grassroots action. Cities organizing themselves, regional campaigns emerging to connect kids to nature. People like you all over the world now are acting, are taking action. And it's happening bottom up and top down. Maybe in the question and answer period we can talk about that more. Let me end by saying that I believe we need to put this movement in an even larger context. The connection of children and nature itself is hugely important. But there are some attributes to this that may go unnoticed. One of them is it tends to bring people into the same room who don't want to be in the same room otherwise. There is something about this issue of reconnecting children to nature that transcends political divisions, transcends religious divisions, it transcends professional divisions. I've seen it happen again and again when regions begin to create their own campaigns to connect kids to nature. These people will not only get in the same room, but to the same table. And so you'll see conservatives sitting next to liberals, sitting next to pediatricians, sitting next to teachers, sitting next to parents, sitting next to grandparents, sitting next to people who don't look like them. You'll see this happen again and again. There is something that touches the heart about this issue that I've not seen in any other issue. And once people get to that table, they begin to see entrenched problems in a different way. I've been at tables where residential developers, you know, the ones that I tried to stop in my woods pulling out, sort of, I've seen those folks get together. Clint Eastwood had a conference at his ranch where I was asked to come and give my sermonette to the most powerful developers in California. And we spent a whole day in workshops. They were excited. How can we build developments in the future that actually connect people to nature instead of divide them? And I kept reminding them, please don't just think about this as another excuse for suburban sprawl. What if we began to redevelop urban neighborhoods that are decaying, or suburban neighborhoods that are decaying, or those redundant shopping malls that are decaying? What if we replaced those in densely populated areas with eco-villages that through design actually create more habitat for nature and connect people to nature? You'll see remarkable things happen when people begin to look at the world through this prism of connecting people to nature. I've become convinced over time that the #1 mental health problem in my country, and I can't speak for yours, but the #1 mental health problem in my country is how we talk about the future. Particularly how we talk about the future to our children. I've become convinced that most Americans, at least, people in my country, if you ask them to conjure up images of what the far future looks like, and do it now and don't wait, just do it, don't be rational, what images come to your mind? In my culture, in my country, the images that are most likely to emerge in people's minds of the far future look a lot like Blade Runner, Mad Max, at best the Hunger Games, at least there's a few trees. It's a post-apocalyptic future. That's what people seem to be accepting subconsciously about what the future is going to be like. The #1 fiction genre for young adults now is called dystopic fiction. For several years it's been this young adult teenager books about a post-apocalyptic world in which not even vampires are having a good time. Are we accepting that? Are we accepting that future? Now, I have nothing against dystopic literature or movies. I like a lot of them. The problem isn't the presence of those dominant images. The problem is that they are dominant. The problem is we don't have another set of images. Not just a sustainable future, not just a survivable future, but of a beautiful, better, great future. We don't have images in my country, in our minds, of that future. So I don't talk that much about sustainability anymore. It's a good word, but to most people it means energy efficiency, and it stops there. I mean, as one great writer has said, do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something better than that? We have to set our sights, our goal, a lot higher than energy efficiency. Otherwise, we'll never get to energy efficiency. So increasingly, what I talk about is nature-rich schools. Schools where kids are spending as much time in the natural world, in reality, as they do in virtual reality. Nature-rich neighborhoods, nature-rich yards filled with native species, nature-rich cities that can become engines of biodiversity and human health, where butterfly migration routes and bird migration routes can be returned in cities. When you begin to see the possibility of a nature-rich future, nature-rich cities, nature-rich schools, nature-rich homes, you can see that in your mind's eye. Unlike a sustainable future, you can see a nature-rich city. You can begin to decorate it with beauty in your mind. We need to begin to create a different picture in our mind of the future for our kids. And nature is key to that. Martin Luther King said and demonstrated in many ways that any culture, any movement will fail if you cannot describe, if you cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. Any movement, any culture will fail if you cannot paint a picture of a future that people will want to go to. That is the most important work, I believe, that teachers can do, that this movement can do, that we can all do, is paint a picture of the future that we really want to go to. And I can tell you, there's a lot of college students I've talked to. If you talk to them only about energy efficiency, their faces like that, you know, yes, we've got to do that, very important, and yes, it's essential, it's absolutely have to. You begin to talk about a nature-rich future, nature-rich cities, you begin to paint that picture, and their face looks like this. They want to do that. They want to go to that future. In fact, they want to help create that future. The first step to painting that future is to take a child outside. Thanks.